The rain did not fall so much as it attacked the city, a cold, relentless downpour that turned sidewalks into mirrors and streetlights into blurry smears of gold. Inside the small flower shop called Petals and Rain, Rosa was finishing her closing duties. Her hands, slightly chilled from the damp air, carefully tucked a sprig of baby's breath into a completed arrangement of white roses. She was a young woman with a gentle face, the kind that seemed to naturally hold a quiet smile, though tonight it was absent. Her dark hair was pulled into a simple ponytail, and her practical sweater was flecked with tiny green leaves from a day's work. The shop was her haven, a place of quiet soil and soft colors, a world away from the growing storm both outside and in her own life. She jumped when the little bell above the door jangled violently. A man stood in the doorway, letting in a gust of wet wind. It was Trent, her ex-boyfriend. His jacket was soaked, and his face was flushed with something more than the cold. "Rosa, you've been ignoring my calls," he stated, his voice tight. He stepped inside, dripping onto her clean floor. Rosa's heart began a heavy, anxious thump against her ribs. "Trent, I asked for space. The shop is closed." "Space." He let out a short, harsh laugh, moving closer. The pleasant scent of roses and earth was suddenly crowded out by the smell of rain and cheap cologne. "You don't get to just dismiss me. We need to talk about this. About us." He gestured wildly as he spoke, his movements sharp and unpredictable. Rosa took a small step back, her hand brushing against the counter where she kept her shears. "There is no us, Trent. It's over. We talked about this. Please just go." But Trent wasn't listening. His words came faster, louder, peppered with accusations and complaints about how she was ungrateful, how she misunderstood him. The cozy shop felt smaller, the walls closing in. The fear that had been a seed in her stomach for weeks now blossomed into a full, choking vine. Her eyes darted to the phone, then to the door behind him. He blocked the way. Then as he leaned in, his finger jabbing the air near her face to make a point, something in Rosa snapped. It wasn't bravery but a pure animal instinct to flee. In a split second, she ducked under his arm, yanked the shop door open and bolted out into the soaking night. "Rosa, get back here." Trent's roar was swallowed by the drumming rain. She ran. Her flats slipped on the wet pavement, but she didn't stop. The cold rain soaked through her sweater in an instant. She didn't think about where she was going, she just needed to be away, to find light, to find other people. Up ahead, a tall, sleek office building glowed like a beacon. It was the kind of place she'd never enter, all dark glass and polished metal, but its lobby was bright and, she hoped, occupied by a security guard. She stumbled through the revolving doors, gasping for breath, a puddle forming around her feet on the marble floor. A bored-looking guard glanced up from his desk. Behind her, through the glass, she could see the dark, furious silhouette of Trent approaching. Panic shot through her again. The elevator bank. It was her only chance. She sprinted across the lobby, her wet shoes squeaking. She slammed her palm against the call button, once, twice, a frantic prayer. Come on, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. She risked a glance back. Trent was at the building's entrance, arguing with the guard who was now standing, holding a hand up to stop him. The elevator dinged, a soft, heavenly sound. The polished silver doors began to slide open with a quiet sigh. Relief flooded her. She would go up anywhere just to get away. She stepped forward to rush inside and froze. The elevator was not empty. A man stood in the center of the spacious car. He was tall and dressed in a suit that looked impossibly expensive, a deep charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the light. His posture was perfectly straight, not leaning against the wall, just standing with an air of absolute stillness. He was older than her, with sharp, handsome features and dark hair touched with silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a cool, penetrating gray, like the stone of the building itself, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, time suspended. She stood there, a drowned, trembling mess in her soggy sweater and jeans, dripping onto the pristine elevator floor. He stood there, a statue of power and control. Behind her, Trent's angry voice echoed across the lobby, getting louder. The guard was losing the argument. The man in the elevator saw it all. He saw her wild, terrified eyes, her shaking hands, the desperate look she threw over her shoulder. His gaze flickered past her to the commotion at the door. Then, without a word, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. An invitation. It was all Rosa needed. She lurched into the elevator, pressing herself against the far wall as the doors began to close. In the narrowing slice of the lobby, she saw Trent break past the guard, his face contorted in rage, just as the silver doors slid shut with a final, silent click. The sudden quiet was deafening. The elevator was soundproofed, a sealed capsule. The only noises were the faint, mechanical hum of its ascent and the ragged, shaky sound of her own breathing. She was acutely aware of the small lake gathering at her feet, of her own pathetic state, and of the powerful, silent stranger who now shared this tiny space. She dared to look at him. He hadn't moved. He wasn't even looking at the button panel. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable. I'm so sorry, Rosa stammered, her voice a thread of sound. I'm getting your floor all wet. I had to. Who was he? The man's voice was low, calm, and smoother than she expected. It wasn't a demand, but it wasn't a question that could be ignored. My ex-boyfriend, she managed to say, wrapping her arms around herself. Tret. He wouldn't leave me alone. The man was silent for a long moment. The elevator continued to climb, the floor numbers lighting up one after another, passing the floors where normal businesses ended and entering the high numbers reserved for penthouses and private offices. He will now, the man said simply. Before Rosa could process what that meant, the elevator came to a gentle stop. The doors opened not onto a hallway, but directly into a space that took her breath away. It was a vast, breathtaking penthouse living room. The far wall was all glass, offering a stunning, dizzying view of the city's glittering skyline through the rain-streaked windows. Everything was elegant and minimalist, soft gray sofas, a single piece of abstract art on the wall, dark wood floors. It was beautiful, but it felt utterly empty, like a museum after hours. The man stepped out and turned, waiting for her. Rosa hesitated, clinging to the elevator wall. This isn't the lobby. No, he agreed. It is not. You are shivering. Come in. I will have my housekeeper bring you a dry robe and some tea. You are safe here. The kindness in his words, so unexpected after the terror of the last hour, was what finally undid her. A single hot tear escaped, mixing with the rain on her cheek. She was so tired, so cold, and so very scared. The word safe felt like a warm blanket. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped out of the elevator and into his world. My name is Lorenzo, he said as the elevator doors closed behind her, sealing her inside the quiet, opulent sky. Rosa stood frozen just beyond the elevator threshold, a small island of dripping disarray in Lorenzo's sea of perfect, silent order. The sheer size of the penthouse seemed to push the air from her lungs. The rain whispered against the immense windows, a soft reminder of the chaotic world far below, a world that now felt like a different planet. She was painfully aware of every small sound she made: the squelch of her shoes, the patter of water from her sleeves hitting the floor, the shaky, uneven rhythm of her breath. Lorenzo watched her for a moment longer, his gray eyes taking in her wide-eyed awe and the tremor in her hands. He moved then, not with haste but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He walked to a discreet panel on the wall, pressed a button and spoke into it, his voice low. Gia, to the living area, please. And bring a robe and towels. The large, soft ones. His instructions were simple, leaving no room for questions. He then turned and walked toward the kitchen, a space of dark stone and stainless steel that gleamed under recessed lights. Sit, he said, not unkindly, gesturing to one of the plush sofas. Please. The word please was what finally unglued her feet from the floor. She moved carefully as if walking on ice, and perched on the very edge of the sofa, trying to minimize the amount of wet fabric touching the exquisite upholstery. She folded her hands in her lap to still their shaking. Lorenzo filled a kettle from a tap and set it on the stove. The mundane, domestic sound of the gas flame clicking to life was strangely jarring in this otherworldly space. A door hidden in the far wall opened, and an older woman with a kind, round face and warm eyes entered. She wore a simple, neat dress and carried a stack of fluffy white towels and a deep blue robe. This was Gia. Her gaze went immediately to Lorenzo, a question in her eyes before settling on Rosa. Her expression softened into one of gentle concern. She said nothing, just walked over and placed the towels and robe on the sofa beside Rosa. Thank you, Gia, Lorenzo said from the kitchen. That will be all for now. Gia nodded, gave Rosa another small, reassuring smile, and retreated through the hidden door, leaving them alone again. The bathroom is through that arch, first door on the right, Lorenzo said, his back to her as he took two simple white mugs from a cabinet. You can change. There is no rush. Rosa stared at the robe. It looked impossibly thick and soft. The practical need for dry clothes warred with the surreal strangeness of the situation. But the chill was settling deep into her bones. Murmuring a quiet "thank you," he likely didn't hear, she gathered the items and hurried in the direction he had indicated. The bathroom was as immaculate and serene as the living room. Everything was marble and polished nickel. She locked the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. What was she doing? She was in a stranger's penthouse, wearing his robe, while her furious ex-boyfriend was probably still circling the block like a shark. She peeled off her soaked clothes, the cold fabric clinging unpleasantly, and dried herself with a towel so plush it felt like a cloud. The robe was even better, wrapping her in warmth that smelled faintly of clean linen and cedar. She looked at her reflection in the vast mirror, a pale face with wide, scared eyes, her damp hair a dark tangle. She looked small, lost. When she emerged, feeling both vulnerable and comforted by the dry fabric, she found Lorenzo standing by the great window, looking out at the storm. 2 steaming mugs sat on the low table before the sofa. He turned as she approached. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, unable to find her voice. She sat again, this time allowing herself to sink slightly into the cushions. He took the seat in a large armchair opposite her, not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them. He did not touch his tea. "The tea is chamomile," he said. "It will help with the shaking." Rosa wrapped her hands around the warm mug. The heat seeped into her palms. She took a tentative sip. It was perfect, soothing, not too hot. The simple act of drinking it grounded her. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. He was studying her, but his gaze was not threatening. It was assessing, curious. "Tell me about Trent," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. And so, haltingly at first, then in a slow, steady stream, she did. She told him about the first charm that had slowly curdled into control, about the jealous accusations over harmless conversations with customers at the flower shop, about the way he would get angry and yell, then apologize with extravagant gifts. She told him about the final terrible fight 2 weeks ago that had made her end it, and about his refusal to accept it, the constant calls, the showing up at her work. She did not cry. She just laid the facts out, simple and weary, into the quiet space between them. Lorenzo listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply absorbed her words, his face an impassive mask, though his eyes seemed to darken as she spoke of Trent's rages. When she finished, the only sound was the distant hum of the city and the soft tap of rain. "He is a bully," Lorenzo stated, the word sounding particularly sharp and final in his mouth. "And bullies only understand one language." Rosa's head shot up. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," she said quickly, a fresh spike of fear cutting through her calm. "I just want him to leave me alone." Lorenzo considered this. Her statement seemed to genuinely give him pause. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "A moral objection to force," he mused, almost to himself. Then his eyes met hers. "An unusual position to take when you are the one being hunted." "It's not a position, it's just me," she said, her voice small but firm. "I don't believe more hurt fixes hurt." A long, silent moment stretched between them. Lorenzo's gaze was intense, as if he were seeing a rare and puzzling artifact. Finally he gave a slow, single nod. "Then we will find another way. For tonight you will stay here. The guest room is prepared. You are safe." That is not a negotiation. The finality in his tone should have been frightening. Instead, it felt like a stone wall being erected between her and the storm. Exhaustion, delayed and total, crashed over her like a wave. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight was gone, leaving her hollow and heavy-limbed. "Thank you," she whispered again, the words feeling insufficient. He stood. "This way." He led her down a softly lit hallway and opened a door to a room almost as large as her entire apartment. It was decorated in creams and pale blues, with another breathtaking window view. The bed was piled with pillows and a thick duvet. It looked like a sanctuary. "Sleep," Lorenzo said from the doorway. "Gia will bring you anything you need in the morning. Do not worry about your Trent. He will not find you here. This building is very secure." He began to close the door, then paused. "Your name?" he said. "You never told me your name." She stood in the middle of the beautiful, strange room, clutching the belt of the robe. "Rosa," she said. "Rosa?" he repeated. The name in his deep, calm voice sounded like a new thing. He gave another slight nod. "Good night, Rosa." The door clicked shut. Rosa stood there for a full minute, listening to the profound silence. She walked to the window and looked out at the glittering, rain-washed city. She could not see the street below, nor her little flower shop, nor Trent. She was in a castle in the clouds, guarded by a quiet king whose rules she did not understand. She crawled into the impossibly soft bed, her mind swirling with the day's terror and the night's impossible rescue. The last thought she had before sleep claimed her was not of fear, but of the careful, curious way Lorenzo had looked at her, and the solid, unshakable sound of his promise. "You are safe here." For the first time in weeks she believed it. Sunlight, sharp and clear after the night's storm, streamed through the vast window of the guest room, painting a warm rectangle across the bed. Rosa awoke slowly, blinking in the unfamiliar brightness. For a disorienting moment, she could not place the feeling of the incredibly soft sheets or the sheer scale of the quiet space around her. Then it all came back: the rain, the chase, the elevator, Lorenzo. She sat up, the deep blue robe still wrapped securely around her. Her damp clothes from the night before were gone from where she had left them in a heap. In their place, neatly folded on a chair, was a simple pair of soft linen pants and a cream-colored sweater. Gia's work, she assumed. The scent of something wonderful, buttered toast, rich coffee, and something sweet like baking apples drifted into the room. Her stomach gave a quiet rumble. She dressed quickly, the borrowed clothes slightly too large but clean and comforting. She padded out into the hallway, following the delicious smell to the main living area. The penthouse in daylight was a different world. The view was no longer a dark tapestry of rain and light, but a sweeping, sun-drenched panorama of the city stretching to a hazy blue horizon. It was beautiful, but it felt even more starkly empty. There were no photographs, no scattered books, no signs of a life lived in. It was a perfect stage set. In the kitchen, Gia was humming softly, sliding golden pastries onto a plate. She looked up and her face broke into a warm, crinkled smile. "Ah, you are awake. Good morning, my dear. You slept well, I hope? You looked so tired last night." "I did, thank you," Rosa said, her voice still husky with sleep. "Thank you for the clothes. And the robe." Of course," Gia said, waving a dismissive hand. "A little bird needs a nest, yes? Now come, sit. You must be hungry. Signor Lorenzo is in his study. He asked that you make yourself at home." Rosa sat at the breakfast bar, feeling awkward. "I don't want to be a bother." "Nonsense," Gia chuckled, setting a plate of flaky pastries, fresh fruit, and a cup of coffee in front of her. "It is a pleasure to cook for someone who appreciates it. He," she said, nodding toward a closed door down the hall, "eats like a soldier. Fuel, not food. Now you enjoy." As Rosa ate the best pastry of her life, she watched Gia move with efficient grace around the kitchen. An idea began to form, a small way to repay even a fraction of the staggering, unasked-for kindness she had received. "Gia," she began tentatively, "the flowers by the elevator, the arrangement is a bit tired. Would it be all right if I fixed it? I'm a florist. It would make me feel useful." Gia's eyes lit up. "A florist? How lovely. And yes, those poor things have seen better days. I'll find you a vase and whatever tools you might need." An hour later, Rosa was on the floor by the great window, surrounded by a bounty Gia had procured as if by magic: a selection of fresh flowers and greens from the building's own floral service, a pair of sharp shears and several elegant, simple vases. She had completely forgotten her fear, lost in the familiar, comforting language of her craft. She trimmed stems, cleared away the old, wilted blooms and began to build. Lorenzo emerged from his study just as she was beginning her second arrangement. He stopped in the hallway, watching her, unseen. She was seated in a pool of sunlight, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands moving with confident, gentle certainty. She placed a stem of deep purple lisianthus, then stepped back, her head tilting as she considered the balance. She added a spray of white astilbe, its feathery texture softening the lines. This was not just putting flowers in a vase, this was creation. He had expected a frightened mouse, cowering in the guest room. He had not expected this quiet, capable artist bringing bursts of color and wild, organic life into his sterile world. The sight of her, so completely absorbed, was disarming. He cleared his throat softly. Rosa jumped, turning quickly. "Oh, I'm sorry. I hope this is okay. I just thought." "It is more than okay," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice quiet. He walked over and looked down at the arrangement taking shape. It was vibrant, full of movement and feeling. It looked like a piece of a summer garden brought inside. "You have a gift." The simple praise sent a warm flush up her neck. "It's just what I do." "It is not just anything," he said. He stood there for a moment, an unusual hesitancy in his posture. "I have some business to attend to outside this afternoon. Would you like to come for a drive? The city looks different from the car. You would be perfectly safe." The offer was so unexpected it stole her breath. A drive? With him? Part of her, the sensible part, screamed that this was how dangerous stories began. But the man before her had asked her permission. He had given her dry clothes, sanctuary, and was now looking at her flowers with what seemed like genuine awe. The man who had promised she was safe. Yes, she heard herself say. I would like that. A short while later, a large, silent car slid up to a private entrance downstairs. A large, serious-faced man with watchful eyes. Marco held the door open. He gave Lorenzo a barely perceptible nod. All clear, boss. Rosa slid into the plush back seat, Lorenzo following beside her. Marco drove. The car was like a vault, sealing out the city's noise. They did not go to crowded places. Lorenzo directed Marco to drive along the river, where the trees were turning gold and orange, and then up through the quieter, grand streets of the old city. Over there, Lorenzo said, pointing to a building with a grand, columned entrance. That was my first office. A single room with a leaking ceiling. He spoke not with nostalgia but with simple fact. And what do you do now? Rosa asked, the question slipping out before she could think better of it. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. I solve problems, he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. I provide security. I manage complex situations for people who cannot use the usual channels. It is a business of agreements and understandings. It was a careful answer, a veiled answer, but it was not a lie. Rosa could sense the vast, unspoken weight behind it. She did not press. Instead, she asked about the buildings, the history of the neighborhoods. He knew surprising, intimate details: which founder had lost his fortune in a shipwreck, which architect had designed this park after his daughter died. The car eventually stopped near a small, tucked-away square with a fountain and a few benches. Would you like to walk for a moment? Lorenzo asked. Marco will be close. They walked slowly around the square. The air was crisp. For a few minutes they didn't speak. The tension that had been a constant hum since she entered the elevator began to melt away, replaced by something else, a tentative, quiet companionship. You see the world differently, Lorenzo said suddenly, stopping to look at a gnarled old tree defiantly growing through the cobblestones. You see flowers where others see weeds. You see beauty in the arrangement of things. And you see the structures, Rosa replied softly, surprising herself. You see the history in the stones, the agreements holding things up. You see the foundations. He looked at her then, a true, direct look that held none of his earlier analytical coolness. In his gray eyes she saw a flicker of profound surprise, and something else, a deep, resonant loneliness that mirrored the empty perfection of his penthouse. It was a look that lasted only a second before the shutters came down again, but she had seen it. Yes, he said, his voice even lower than usual. I suppose I do. On the drive back, as the sunset painted the sky in hues of rose and amber, Lorenzo did something utterly simple. He asked her about her flower shop. He listened as she described the challenge of sourcing garden roses in the winter, the joy of designing a wedding bouquet, the elderly Mr. Henderson who bought a single red carnation every Friday for his wife. Lorenzo listened, really listened, as if her small world of petals and soil was the most fascinating ledger he had ever studied. When they returned to the penthouse, the first thing Rosa saw were her two finished arrangements. One stood by the elevator, a vibrant, welcoming burst of color. The other was now centered on the low table in the living room, softening the hard lines of the room, making it feel, for the first time, less like a showroom and more like a place someone could live. She stood beside them, and Lorenzo stood beside her. He did not thank her again. He simply looked from the flowers to her face, and in that look was a universe of unspoken things: gratitude, curiosity, and the dawning, unsettling realization that her brief, colorful intrusion had, in a single day, become the most interesting thing in his carefully controlled world. The fragile peace of the past 2 days had woven a delicate cocoon around Rosa, one made of quiet conversations, Gia's warm pastries, and the shared, silent appreciation of the flowers that now bloomed in every corner of the penthouse. She had almost, for moments at a time, forgotten the fear that had brought her here. Lorenzo had been a courteous, if enigmatic, host. He would join her for meals, ask thoughtful questions about her work, and listen with an intensity that was both flattering and unnerving. He spoke little of himself, but his world began to feel less like a fortress and more like a strangely beautiful sanctuary. It was on the third morning that Lorenzo suggested an outing. There is a bookstore, he said over coffee. Small, old, owned by a friend. It is quiet. The shelves go to the ceiling. I think you would like it. The offer was a gift, an acknowledgement of her need to step beyond these walls, and she accepted with a grateful smile. Marco drove them, his eyes constantly scanning the streets in the rearview mirror, a silent reminder of the world Lorenzo inhabited. The bookstore was exactly as described, a dusty, wonderful cave of stories tucked away on a cobblestone lane. The air smelled of old paper and leather. Lorenzo introduced her to the elderly owner, Mr. Aldo, who peered at her over his glasses before giving Lorenzo a slow, knowing nod, as if Rosa had passed some unspoken test. For an hour, Rosa was blissfully lost. She trailed her fingers along cracked spines, pulled out volumes of poetry and books on botanical illustration. Lorenzo watched her from a worn armchair, a faint, uncharacteristic smile touching his lips as she piled a small stack of finds on a table. He was not reading. He was simply being, a calm presence in the calm space. The bell above the shop door jangled. Rosa, immersed in a book of pressed flower art, thought nothing of it. But she saw Lorenzo's smile vanish. She saw Marco, who had been browsing near the window, snap to attention, his body shifting subtly into a defensive stance. A man's voice, slurred and angry, cut through the quiet. "I know she's with you. I followed the car. You think I'm stupid?" Rosa's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Trent. He stood just inside the doorway, his clothes rumpled, his eyes wild and red-rimmed. He looked like he hadn't slept. Mr. Aldo moved to intervene, but Marco was already stepping forward, a human wall. Before Marco could reach him, the shop door opened again. This time, two well-dressed but grim-faced men entered. They ignored Trent completely. Their eyes were fixed on Lorenzo, who had risen from his chair with a terrifying liquid grace. He did not look surprised. He looked cold. "Lorenzo," the lead man said, his voice oily. "We need to talk. Your new distraction is making you sloppy. Easy to follow." His gaze slid dismissively to Rosa, then back to Trent, as if both were merely inconvenient insects. The world seemed to fracture into jagged pieces. Trent, fueled by jealous rage. The two men exuding a professional, predatory threat. And in the center, Lorenzo, who had transformed. The thoughtful man who discussed poetry was gone. In his place stood a figure of absolute, hardened authority. His posture was different, wider, more dominant. His gray eyes, usually so focused on her, were now chips of flint, assessing the two men, then Trent, calculating angles and threats with a speed that was frightening. "Antonio sent children to do a man's work," Lorenzo said, his voice devoid of all warmth. It was a blade of sound. "And you brought a noisy puppy with you. How unprofessional." Trent, enraged at being called a puppy and emboldened by what he perceived as backup, lunged. Not at Lorenzo but toward Rosa. "She's coming with me." What happened next unfolded in a blur of efficient, brutal motion. Lorenzo did not shout. He moved. In two strides he was between Trent and Rosa. As Trent swung a clumsy fist, Lorenzo caught his wrist, twisted it with a crisp, sharp motion that made Trent cry out in pain, and used his own momentum to shove him hard into a tall bookshelf. Romance novels and classics cascaded down on Trent as he crumpled, groaning. But Lorenzo's attention was already elsewhere. The two men, seeing their moment, moved in tandem. Marco engaged the first, a swift, silent struggle of blocks and strikes near the philosophy section. The second man came at Lorenzo, a short, menacing baton appearing in his hand. Rosa watched, paralyzed. This was not a street fight. This was something else, a terrible, practiced dance. Lorenzo dodged the first swing of the baton with an almost lazy ease. He didn't brawl. He dismantled. He grabbed the man's arm, drove a knee into his side, and with a wrenching twist, disarmed him, sending the baton clattering across the floor. He finished with a single, precise strike to the jaw, and the man dropped like a sack of stones. It was over in less than a minute. Trent was sobbing amidst the books, clutching his wrist. The two men from Antonio were unconscious or wishing they were. Marco had his man pinned, breathing heavily. The only sound was the frantic ticking of an old clock and Rosa's own shallow, panicked breaths. Lorenzo stood amidst the wreckage, his suit jacket still perfectly in place. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and meticulously wiped his hands as if cleaning off dirt. Then and only then did he turn to look at Rosa. All the cold fury was still in his eyes. He was not the man who had listened to her talk about carnations. He was the boss. The reality of what he was, what he did, the world he commanded, slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The careful words, solving problems, agreements and understandings, they were a beautiful lie. This was the truth. This was the foundation. He saw the horror on her face. He saw her take an involuntary step back from him, her hand flying to her mouth. The flint in his eyes flickered just for a second with something that looked like pain. He took a step toward her. Rosa? She shook her head, the movement frantic. The cocoon was shattered, the sanctuary revealed as a battlefield. She looked from his fierce, unfamiliar face to the groaning men on the floor, to the wreck of the beautiful, peaceful shop. This was the language he understood. This was the cost of the safety he provided. Without a word, she turned and fled, pushing past the stunned Mr. Aldo, bursting out onto the sunlit cobblestone lane. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran like she had that first night in the rain, but this time she was fleeing the rescue as much as the danger. The image of Lorenzo, cold and ruthless and terrifyingly capable, was seared behind her eyes. The man she had started to what? To feel something for? He did not exist. He was a story she had told herself among the flowers. The real man was the one who broke wrists and jaws without breaking a sweat. And that man, she realized with a fresh wave of terror, was now walking swiftly after her, his long strides easily closing the distance she had desperately tried to create. Rosa did not get far. Her flight was one of pure, disoriented panic, and the quiet, winding lanes of the old city were a maze she did not know. She turned a corner into a narrow, dead-end alley, her breaths coming in sharp, painful gasps. She pressed her back against the cool, rough brick, the sun-warmed stone at odds with the cold dread pooling in her stomach. The sound of steady, unhurried footsteps echoed on the cobblestones behind her. She squeezed her eyes shut as if she could make the world disappear. The footsteps stopped at the mouth of the alley. She opened her eyes. Lorenzo stood there, silhouetted against the bright street, blocking her exit. He was not even breathing heavily. He simply stood, waiting. The ruthless mask he had worn in the bookstore was gone, but the gentle host was gone too. In their place was a man stripped bare, his face etched with a grim, weary honesty. "Please," she whispered, the word cracking. "Don't come any closer." He obeyed, holding his hands up, palms open, in a gesture of surrender. "I will not touch you. I will not come closer. But you must listen to me, Rosa. You must hear the whole truth, not just the piece of it you saw in there." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "I saw enough. You hurt them. You broke that man's arm like it was nothing." "I stopped him from reaching you," Lorenzo said, his voice low and urgent. "The other men, they work for Antonio, a rival who sees any softness as a weakness. My showing you kindness, taking you for a drive, it was seen as a vulnerability. They were there to exploit it, to hurt me by hurting you. What you saw was not me solving a problem. It was me preventing a tragedy." He took a slow, deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of his own words. "This is my world. It is violent. It is ugly. It is a world of threats and power, and for 20 years, I have ruled it by being the hardest, the coldest, the most feared man in the room." He paused, his gray eyes searching her terrified face. "And then a drowned, brave woman ran into my elevator. You looked at me not as a boss, not as a threat, but as a person who could help. You talked to me about flowers. You made my empty home feel alive. You asked for no one to be hurt, even the man who hunted you." His voice dropped to a raw whisper. "For the first time in 2 decades, I wanted to be someone else. I wanted to be the man you saw when you didn't know who I was." The raw confession hung in the air between them, more disarming than any show of force. Rosa's frantic breathing began to slow. She stared at him, seeing not just the fearsome boss, but the lonely man in the penthouse, the one who had studied her flower arrangements as if they were maps to a better country. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am saying you have a choice," he stated, his tone becoming clear and deliberate, a businessman laying out terms. "A real choice. Not one made from fear or confusion. Option 1. He held up a single finger. "I will have Marco drive you to your apartment right now. I will have my lawyers file a restraining order against Trent so powerful he will move to another state. I will deposit enough money in a new bank account for you to open the biggest, most beautiful flower shop you can imagine, anywhere in the world. You will never see me or hear from me again. You will be safe, you will be prosperous, and you will be free of all of this. Of him. Of me. Of my world." The offer was staggering. It was everything she could need. A clean escape. A dream fulfilled. Yet the way he said it, so final, so self-sacrificing, made her heart clench. "An option 2?" she breathed, almost afraid to ask. He lowered his hand, his gaze intensifying, holding hers with a gravity that pulled at something deep within her. "Option 2, he said softly. "You come back with me. Not as a prisoner in a penthouse, but as a woman who walks beside me. You open your flower shop here in this city under my protection, which means it will never be threatened by anyone, ever again. You teach me about your world of beauty and growth. And I will work every single day to be the man who deserves to be in it. I will not lie to you again. The violence will not vanish, but it will never touch you. It will remain outside the door, and I will come home to you and wash its stain away. He took one careful, tentative step forward. I'm not a good man, Rosa, but I could be a better one for you. The choice is yours, and it is the most important one I will ever make. I will abide by whatever you decide. Silence descended upon the alley, thick and heavy. Rosa looked at him, really looked. She saw the man who had killed the flowers in his home because he didn't know how to care for them. She saw the man who had ordered chamomile tea for her shaking hands. She saw the fierce, terrifying protector who had placed himself between her and every danger. And she saw the profound, aching loneliness that had preceded her, and that would certainly follow if she left. Her fear did not disappear. It simply settled, making room for something else, a daring, terrifying, beautiful understanding. He was offering her not just safety but a shared life. He was offering to change, not demanding she accept him as he was. He was giving her all the power. She unpeeled herself from the wall. She took one step, then another, closing the distance he had promised not to cross. She stopped an arm's length away, her eyes glistening. The big flower shop, she said, her voice finding a new strength. I want it here. I want the window boxes to be overflowing so everyone on the street can see them. And I want you to help me choose the colors. For a moment, Lorenzo did not move. He simply stared, as if her words were a language he had forgotten how to hear. Then, the most extraordinary thing happened. The lines of tension and control on his face melted away, and a real, true, and utterly vulnerable smile touched his lips. It transformed him entirely. He looked younger. He looked at peace. I would like that very much, he whispered. He did not kiss her. He did not embrace her. He simply offered her his hand, palm up, an invitation. A question. After a heartbeat, Rosa placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, not with possession but with promise. Together, they walked out of the alley and back toward the waiting car, toward the future they would now build, not in a sterile penthouse in the sky, but in the messy, beautiful, grounded world of growing things. Want to see their story unfold? See Rosa's dream shop come to life, and watch Lorenzo learn the names of every rose? Subscribe to stay with their beautiful grown-up love story every step of the way.